Hey everyone! Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on something that every single business has to deal with. What does it truly cost to get something done? We're going to follow the story of a brand new t-shirt company, from just an idea in someone's head to a full-blown operation, all to understand how businesses figure out if they're actually winning.
But before we dive in, let me ask you this. If a company is making a profit, cash in the bank, does that automatically mean starting it was a smart decision? It seems like a simple yes, but the real answer is, well, it's a lot more interesting, and it's all about the hidden costs that you don't see on a spreadsheet.
All right, to get to the bottom of that, let's start at the very beginning. Picture an entrepreneur. They've got this awesome idea for a t-shirt company. Now, even before they print a single shirt, they've already made a sacrifice. To figure out if this whole venture is a good idea, we have to ask, what is the real cost of just taking that first step?
So it turns out there are two completely different ways to think about cost. On one hand, you have the accounting cost. This is what an accountant would care about, the cold, hard cash you're spending. The money going out for things like ink, blank shirts, and rent. But an economist looks at the world differently. They see the economic cost, which is all of that stuff plus the invisible cost of what you had to give up to make it happen.
And that what you give up part? That is a name. It's called an implicit cost. Let's imagine our t-shirt founder quit a pretty good job that paid, say, $60,000 a year. Now, they're not writing a $60,000 check to anyone, but that lost income, that's a very real, even though it's invisible, cost of doing business.
And that $60,000 salary they gave up? That's the opportunity cost. This idea is the absolute heart of economic thinking. It's the value of the road you didn't take. So let's go back to our first question. What if the t-shirt business makes a $50,000 profit in its first year? The accountant says, great job, but the economist says, hold on, you actually lost $10,000 compared to what you could have been doing. And that is how you know if you're truly winning. Okay, so our founder has taken the leap. They've weighed the opportunity cost, and the t-shirt shop is officially open for business. Now things get real. We need to get a handle on the day-to-day costs of actually making the product. In economics, this is what we call the short run, a period where some things, like the size of your shop, are basically set in stone.
Now, in this short run, all your costs pretty much fall into two big buckets. First, you've got your fixed costs. Think of the monthly rent on the shop or the payment on that big t-shirt printing press. You have to pay these bills whether you print one shirt or 1,000 of them. Then you've got your variable costs. These are the costs that go up and down with production. The more shirts you make, the more you're going to spend on blank tees and ink. Simple as that. And here's how those two costs come together to give you your total cost. It's just fixed plus variable. But look at the table. Notice that even if you produce 0 shirts, you still have a total cost of $1,000. That's your rent and other fixed expenses. Then, as you start printing, those variable costs for the shirts and ink kick in, and your total bill starts to climb. So, you're up and running, you're making shirts, and you're tracking your total costs. That's great. But how do you know if you're being, efficient? To figure that out, you have to stop looking at the big total number and start looking at the cost per shirt. This is how you find your production sweet spot.
To find that sweet spot, we need a few new tools. We can look at the average cost for our fixed expenses, our variable expenses, and of course, the total. But the real game changer, the number that drives all the smart decisions, is that last one, marginal cost. This is the magic number. It tells you exactly how much it costs to produce just one more t-shirt.
So in the beginning, everything is going great. With every new t-shirt the company prints, the cost to make each one actually goes down. Why is that? Well, they're spreading that big, fixed rent payment over more and more shirts. The team is getting into a groove, they're finding their rhythm, the average cost is falling, and the whole place feels like a well-oiled machine.
But then, something starts to change. The shop gets a little crowded. Maybe the two employees start bumping into each other. You have to start paying overtime to get a big order out. The cost of producing that very next shirt, that's our marginal cost, it starts to creep up. This is a classic case of what economists call diminishing returns.
And this whole dynamic, where costs fall and then start to rise, it creates this famous U-shaped curve for your average total cost. It drops down as you get more efficient, it hits this perfect low point, and then it starts to climb back up as things get a little chaotic. And that lowest point of the U, that is the sweet spot. That's the most efficient number of shirts your shop can possibly produce.
So, how do you know you're at the bottom of that U without just, guessing? Well, there's a really cool rule for this.
Your most efficient point is exactly where the cost of making one more shirt, the marginal cost, is equal to the average cost. Think about it. As long as the next shirt you make is cheaper than the average, it's pulling the average down. But the second that next shirt is more expensive than the average, it starts pulling the average up. They cross paths right at that perfect minimum point.
All right, our little t-shirt company has totally mastered its current setup. They found their sweet spot. But what happens when orders start pouring in and they just can't keep up? It's time to stop thinking about the short run and start planning for the long run, where suddenly everything is on the table.
Now, the biggest difference in the long run is that, really, there are no more fixed costs. Everything becomes variable. You are no longer stuck with your small shop. You can choose to move to a much bigger factory, you can buy 5 more t-shirt presses, you could even build a mega warehouse if you wanted to.
Each of these potential sizes, from a tiny garage setup all the way to a mega warehouse, it has its own unique U-shaped cost curve. The garage is super cheap to start, but it gets inefficient really fast. The small factory costs more upfront, but it handles bigger orders like a champ. And that warehouse, it only makes sense if you're producing at a massive, massive scale. The whole challenge of long-run planning is picking the right-sized operation for the amount you plan to sell.
This brings us to a really important idea: the long-run average cost curve. People often call it the planning curve, and for good reason. You can picture it like a big envelope that holds all of those smaller short-run curves. It basically shows you the absolute lowest possible cost you can achieve for any level of production, because it helps you choose the perfect factory size for that level. It's your roadmap for growth.
Now, it might seem obvious that as you get bigger, things just get more efficient. But is that always true? Let's take a look at why this long-run planning curve also ends up being U-shaped and explore the pros and the cons of scaling up.
So in the beginning, as our t-shirt company gets bigger and bigger, it starts to experience what we call economies of scale. This means the cost per shirt actually goes down as they produce more. This is that downward sloping part of the long-run curve, the part where, yeah, bigger really is better.
So why does that even happen? Well, there are a bunch of reasons. For one, they can now afford better, faster, more specialized printing machines. They can also start buying their blank t-shirts and ink in huge quantities, which gets them massive bulk discounts. They can even afford to hire a dedicated marketing expert or a finance pro to manage the books. Even banks start to see them as less of a risk, so they can get bigger loans at better interest rates.
But that ride doesn't last forever. Eventually, a company can get, well, too big. And this is where diseconomies of scale start to kick in. The very things that made the company strong, its size, now start to become a burden. Management can become chaotic, communication between departments breaks down, and simple decisions get tangled up in bureaucracy and red tape. And just like that, the cost per shirt starts to creep back up again.
So when you put it all together, what's the big takeaway? It's that a truly smart business understands the entire spectrum of costs. It's about seeing that invisible opportunity cost when you start, mastering the day-to-day cost to be efficient, and carefully navigating the challenges of getting bigger. That complete picture, that's the difference between just being busy and building a truly sustainable business.
And that really brings us to our final thought. Now that you can see beyond just the dollars and cents on a page, I'll leave you with the question to think about. In your own work, or your career, or maybe your next big personal project, what's the hidden opportunity cost that you need to consider? Thanks so much for watching.